YOLO, composing gloves here. And today we're going to be taking a look at hearing the difference between a phaser, flanger, of course, and I also tacked on Unison because I got asked about this. Someone had gone through some of the explanations of why they're technically different, but what they technically do and using them in music are two different things. So we're going to talk about what they sound like because they each have their own distinctive sound. You can pretty much identify what process they probably use simply from hearing it. And that's a really valuable skill. Also, it allows you to do a lot of interesting sound design. I'm going to show you several things you could consider that have a pretty large impact on the way your sound sounds. So first, we have just this sort of basic sound. That is our basic sound, right? And I wrote out a melody because I want it to be a musical example. And I'm automating the resonance, the frequency, and the pitch vibrato. And so it sounds like this. So pretty standard melody type material. Added in some drums. We'll probably mess with these a bit later. Cool, so that's what we're working with. So first we gotta have something that's, kind of musical. And I just did some automation on things that I thought would be cool. So next up is, let's first take a look at the phaser. So the phaser is an interesting one. Now, 3 of these are audio effects. Now, this is a special kind of phaser. So there's different kinds of phasers, but phasers make holes in your sound, right? So if I turn the phaser on, let's just listen to see what happens, right? So here it is wet. I quite like phasers for leads of this nature because a phaser is a moving thing. It's creating holes, and some phasers work on making holes, therefore making other things sound like resonances, while other phasers sound like they put resonance into your sound. Most phasers go about it with a series of, it's supposed to take place through actual phasing, but nowadays it's usually approached via bandpass filters. So there's a bunch of different ways because we're going after a sound. So it's named a phaser, but the way they accomplish the actual sound of the phaser is sort of, and some plugins, it's not at all how you would technically do phasing. But anyways, we can see that it's a rolling sound. And we have this cool changing texture as we go up. And now this is really cool. Let's turn this down. Let's turn the pluck knob all the way on, right? So we have just this. And so this right here is not okay because, well, I don't think it sounds that great because it just sort of sounds like this, I'd call it mud or whatever. It's just not clear. But if we add a phaser, it adds some resonant sharpness in the middle of this, and that gives us a lot more motion. The melody seems to come out a little bit better. So a phaser right now, these are rolling holes. So that means that we can adjust the size and width of these holes via the width knob. And this will make our sound, it'll spread the resonance out. Let me just show you. Let's turn it all the way up, sort of as an extreme example. So in this case, probably not the best idea because it is emphasizing a whole bunch of harmonics that aren't related to our fundamentals. So here, this is a large width would probably be a bad idea. But if we take our width down, we get this sort of, Oh, by the way, I'm also using a Twins. Let's go to classic real quick. So, but anyways, with the width down, we get a more narrow spectrum. And so that's not quite the same as like what we had before. So as we narrow the spectrum, the resonance becomes more apparent to us. And as far as what frequencies it's specifically affecting. Whereas if it's too wide, it's affecting so many frequencies that it sort of ruins the idea of pitch for us. So there's the hole that I was talking about earlier. But as you saw here, this was, we were using, I think, Twins. Now, Harmer has the ability to actually make a custom phaser layout on how it affects frequencies. It's pretty cool. But that's like a Harmer specific thing. Now, if we go back to, let's check out what deep sounds like. I probably like twins the most. So we're going to run with twins. And I'm going to turn my width up. I feel like, I could use a little more width on this. If you move the parameters during it, you'll get this sort of interesting. Now you can do something musical with that. So let's create an automation clip. I'll use regular automation for this and just check it out. Maybe on this tone, we wanted to have this sort of interesting movement. So we could do something like maybe this. So we could get like these little bites, or we could bring it like down. Let's see that. So that's pretty interesting. So, you could go look for musical places for impact and add in these little bouts of phaseriness. And that's adjusting just the width. We could also mess with things like the offset, which is just where our phaser starts working. So a bunch of interesting things. It sounds really cool in a sound like this because it's a moving sound. So that's what a phaser sounds like. It always is going to have this sort of like, you'll hear, if I were to pull open, let me show you like the classic, like, oh, yep, that's a phaser sound. If you hear stuff like, we're just playing a sound. Let me turn this down. Let me show you too. That just screams phaser. Maybe you have a particular spot you really like how it sounds. Maybe there's a particular whole set that you just really enjoy. So you may bring the speed way down. Pretty much keeps it where it is. It still slightly moves, but it's mostly there. In our first example, let's say we found a spot we really liked. Well, we might move our speed way down. And then we could adjust the offset to move the holes around. Say, maybe that's the sound we're really into. So that's like sort of if you want to control on your own, you don't want it just a free running cycle. So there you go. That's pretty much phasers. A lot of phasers will produce sounds very similar to this, these resonancy textures or this whole like sound coming up the phaser. So let's move over to chorus. So chorus is what it does is this is an audio effect. So it's taking our audio, delaying it by a very small amount, and then it's modulating the pitch we actually build one of these in Reactor. So there's actually different ways you could do this, but essentially it's a delay based effect. It's a chorus and it creates a pitch variation. So generally it has a muddy sound associated with it. If we turn up our order. So, okay, we have a couple controls, right? We have depth and speed. Spread is, how far are we going to pan our cloned audio delay. So we're going to have a regular, just a straight out, and that's controlled by our mix, the balance here. But we're going to have these clones as well. And they're going to we can tell them to go to the left or to the right. Those are going to have the pitch variation. When combined with our original, we're going to get this interesting mix. And so just like a standard one usually has the depth up, like midway. And the speed is the amount of pitch variation, like basically the frequency of the pitch variation that's taking place. However, depending on the way it was built, these could mean different things. But in most chorus plugins, that's usually what speed is referring to. It's the rate at which how much detuning essentially kind of takes place. So see, we immediately get a stereo image, so that's like a dead giveaway. And now we have our spread very large. That's controlling that, so we'll bring that down. So if you ever hear, so this is a way you could accomplish a detune lead if you ever hear your speed really high up. But if we bring this way down, and we bring our depth way down, and now we could have an order 3. I'm not really going to get into the whole idea of order. But you can hear there's a clear difference in that versus that. This sounds much more open. And you see we've done very little. We've simply basically introduced, there's almost no variation in the speed. It's basically just cloning things and panning them according to our spread. But they do interact slightly, and that slight interaction causes it to sound, I think it sounds more warm than just a static pan. But we could bring our depth up. Let me show you the depth here. So we hear it gets kind of muddy as we get further up on the depth. This is the amount it's allowed to, I think this actually might be the amount of pitch variation, like the amplitude of it, where the speed is the actual frequency of the pitch variation. I'm not like 100% sure for this particular chorus effect, but that's usually how it works. I always say also that like on a if we were to just take a standard like saw wave and play it, whoops, I'm pretty low there. Am I controlling the right thing? I don't think I am. Nope, I'm not. There we go. So we've got our sound. Chorus generally tends to make things sound muddy if used sort of unintentionally. Maybe you want things to sound a little blurry. Maybe you want it as like a background layer for a vocal. Maybe you're going to clone a background layer, throw a bunch of chorus on it, so it's really like muddy. And that's another, this is like a classic chorus sound. But what you could do is you could take your vocal, clone it, slap a ton of chorus on it, then send it through a verb with only wet, and you get this glorious sort of, let me show you. If we were to just slap a verb on here, something that, let's just do, where's a reverb? Here's a verb, let's take that. No dry, just wet, right? And it's basically, it sounds a little bit like, it sounds a little comb filtered. That's mostly this particular verb's fault. We'll bring up the size. And you could throw that in, you could accomplish a really cool atmosphere just by doing something like that. So that's a little bit about the chorus, the depth. As you can see, with very low values for the depth and speed, you're able to accomplish very cool sort of automatic panning effects. And with very high levels, you're able to mix between. So if you have like a low depth but a high speed, you get something like that, which is like the detuned lead sound. This is a pretty extreme example, super retro. But if we brought up our depth and brought down our speed, we get a very slow, almost, well, basically a phaser-y type deal. Because as our thing oscillates back and forth, we're going to hear some light phasing. So it's just like a way less extreme version, sort of. And when you have a sound that's already got quite a bit going on, let me... Now, I didn't talk about the delay. This just delays your sound. This is usually good for establishing an initial offset. So let me just show you if I do this. So it's literally just delaying the sound. So maybe you have a particular way you want it to come in. This delay can essentially be used to establish a kind of, it's like a sort of like a Haas effect type deal. So maybe there's a particular initial phase relationship you like. So there you go, that's chorus. If you hear like anything that has this sort of, the ones that are really easy to detect are sounds of this nature. Related to the chorus is the unison. So a chorus is going to take a delay path, right? Unison does not need a delay path. Unison only exists in synthesizers with additive capabilities. What it is it's like a chorus, only a unison sounds different in that it takes your initial signal, and since you're generating it, it can clone it before you don't even have to delay anything. And it's simply going to clone your signal and play it at a different pitch value. It's able to pan it independently and even affect the phase of the voices independently. So this is a really interesting option in that you have these different modes you're able to go at it in. But basically, you get very similar sounds to unison. It's much more processor intensive, but check it out. So there's a 4. Let's go to a 4 here. Very similar sound. If you're going to go for that really like coarse sound, something like this. we could accomplish something similar here. This one oftentimes sounds much cleaner in my opinion. However, it's so much more intensive, and you can usually get very, very similar sounds to chorus. So if you experiment and you find, usually this matters more with a very processed sound, then it's going to be, then you'll have a starker difference between them, and you might choose one over the other based on sound reasons. Because that's why you want to choose things. But if your CPU can't take it, chorus is the way you want to go for sounds of this nature. And you only really want to grab the Unison for special things. So one of the things I like grabbing the Unison for is the Unison has this pitch. So it's got a similar idea. We can do pitch variation. So now you notice when we push the pitch on this, it doesn't sound like distortion. But when we push the pitch on this, speed, we get this like sort of chunky high end, like this. It sounds like a ripping sound, and I'm not the biggest fan of that. So a Unison though doesn't, because of the nature of the process, it sounds a little more natural, as natural as you can get with a synthesizer. So I had my pan way up too, so that probably helps a bit. So, okay, we can accomplish similar things. Now, what's really cool is on an order 2, check it out. If we bring our pitch variation down so that it's basically neck and neck with our original signal. And then we toss a phaser on. I mean, not a phaser. We then can mess with the phase of the other voices independently. And this is like really cool. This is something that, because it's being additively generated, we're able to do this. So we can move this knob or the slider around and get very specific relationships. Versus. So you see, it's pretty subtle stuff, but sometimes this can actually be a super big deal. If we do something where our notes are very short, this could become a significantly important knob. I actually use this technique in my track Killer Ladybugs, which you could check out if you want. It opens up with a synth based on that idea right there. So a very cool way of using the Unison. Unison basically just sounds like a chorus though. And finally, we have a flanger. Now, Harmor doesn't have a flanger in it. You could accomplish very flange-like effects with a chorus, but the big difference between a chorus and a flanger is your feedback path. So there's actually a variety of ways you could set this up, but we could get into all the details of like how to build them. But basically, a flanger can utilize feedback. I'm using the M flanger, but FL has their own deal. But I have a setting here with high feedback. You hear flangers sort of just tossed in these random spots. Like, it's almost dead obvious it's a flanger if you can hear it. Because they have that yo, yo, yo sound in them. So I really appreciate it when I hear a track that uses a phaser very creatively. You'll hear them all the time on drum fills. Because I feel like this is one of those effects that can just show up and it's just like, what the heck is this doing here? And other times you hear it used in a very, like, it fits right where it's supposed to be. And so I always appreciate it when they like have these sorts of, have that sort of sound coming at me. So anyways, you also have a delay time here. This delay time is very important. I'm not going to like talk about every single knob on here, but essentially you are again delaying your signal. And this time you are changing what originally came from tape machines. You're changing the speed of the tape machine. And you're sort of doing a similar thing in DSP land with chorus. So they're accomplished by very similar processes, only now we've got this feedback capability. So when our feedback's really low, phasers always have this yo sound, at least to some level in there, most of the time. There are some settings, if you keep things really modest, that it doesn't have this. But if we bring our feedback way up, so I feel like phaser is the easiest one to hear out of the bunch. So that is the sound of a flanger. And you know what? I'm probably going to create a bunch of audio files in post and put them up. So here's the deal. I'm going to create some audio files being affected by various components independently, and then I'll probably have a couple of them mixed. And you have to tell me, or you have to figure out by yourself, just by listening, which process I am using. And so I'll add those in post, and then if you get them all right, post your score down below. We'll do 10 examples. Post your score down below and see how you did. Can you guess all 10 correctly? Well, not guess, because guessing obviously ain't going to work that great for you. I will accept Unison and chorus as the same for now. In fact, I'll just avoid Unison, because Unison is a special case only for additive synths. You could toss a chorus, a flanger, or, you could toss that on anything. And so I'll have some violins, some drums and stuff. So go ahead. We'll do that now. All right, so I don't know how you did. How'd you do? Let me know down below. Hopefully you found this useful. You got some interesting ideas taken away from this. It's after you hear sort of what these things sound like, you're like, oh yeah, that's what that would do, or that's what this would do, and so on and so forth. Now I had reverb on these examples, but I mean, you're going to hear these things on processed sound, so we might as well get an idea of what they have to offer us. And we also didn't talk about more advanced topics, like where in the signal chain we would introduce these things. I guess it's not too advanced, but basically, if you have some sort of creative goal, that could really matter. And the spot you put a chorus before you run it into a distortion could have a large effect on your sound. So also keep in mind that there's like signal flow and signal processing order we could also consider here. Like for example, I generally will want to run my verb last, but sometimes you will run your verb into some distortion. Usually you'll have modest settings on your verb with a specific ideal or goal in mind. But it wouldn't make a lot of sense to distort our reverb most of the time because that's going to sound really bad usually. But sometimes, it sounds cool. So signal flow, things of that nature, just keep those in mind as well. Subscribe, support me on Patreon, and have a blessed day.